about Daddy's and my ancestors. We've had a little bit of luck, perhaps more than average, because there is a keep genealogy in the Northampton Library, and also Uncle Leon looked up and found some facts about the Richardson family. According to the records, two brothers named Thomas and John Richardson landed somewhere in the shores of what later became Massachusetts and settled in a section that later became Cambridge. Later on, some of the family moved to Maine and others stayed in New England. Our branch of the family consists of 4 brothers and 2 sisters named George Augustus, Roscoe, who went to Maine, Farwell and T. Coburn stayed in Massachusetts, Farwell in South Acton, Mass., and T. Coburn in Western Mass. I think the sisters Martha and Sabrina went to Minnesota. I believe that T. Coburn Richardson was the ancestor of Grandpa Richardson, since Coburn is a name in the family, and as you know, my cousin Ruth and Lucy had a brother named Coburn. The Richardson family must have stayed around Boston because, as far as I know, Grandpa Richardson and Grandma Richardson were married there and lived in Revere at first. Now I'll have to go back a bit because I have a story about Grandma Richardson and her childhood that I think's of interest. I believe her maiden name was Reynolds and that she was an only child. When she was very little, her father and her grandfather got the wanderlust and decided that they would move to what later became Aroostook County up in Maine, near a town called Caribou. So they loaded up as much as they could with 1 or 2 teams. I never was sure exactly how many. And Grandma, her mother and grandmother, her father and grandfather, all started out for Maine. The 2 women were agreeable to this move, but they made one stipulation, and that was that they would have to stop and build their cabin at a place where one of the women could wash a linen handkerchief in the spring and get it clean. In other words, soft and good drinkable water was an essential to them. They finally found a place and camped there until the men had made a one-room building with what used to be called a puncheon floor. That is just a dirt floor that was tamped down and beaten down so it was fairly flat. Then they must have had, I don't know what they used, but I guess they must have had either cloth or paper, something, because Grandma said they greased this to make to cover a window and let light through. Apparently things went pretty well, and they must have lived there several years until they had a crop to sell. They took that up to Caribou. Now at that time the only road was what was called it was called a corduroy road. That is, if it was swampy land, logs would be laid side by side, giving the effect of corduroy, and pretty bumpy. And that was what one drove over until firm ground was reached. When the men sold their load of whatever they had in Caribou and started back, they were riding on an empty sledge, which was what they had taken their produce to. That is no more than 2 runners with a platform built over it that would go through the mud and various horrible kinds of going that they had. Grandma's father was standing up, I imagine standing up driving, and when they hit the one piece of corduroy, and the sledge gave a great lurch. He was thrown forward, and the sledge went over his head, and of course he was immediately killed. After that sad episode, there was only Grandma's grandfather left to do all of the hard work of clearing and planting and trying to make a living for the family. And obviously it was too much. So they packed up what small things they had taken with them that were still fit to bring back and made the long trip back to the environs of Boston. Now, I left out several important facts going back to when the two Richardsons landed in Massachusetts. The date was 1640. Now, as to two names, Grandma Richardson's name was Eva. Grandpa Richardson's name was Marion. They had 4 children. The oldest was Uncle Leon, whom you call Uncle Two Bits. The next was my father, whose name was Edward, and who died between the ages of 25 and 26. The next one was Leon, who died a long time ago, and the youngest was my Aunt Marion, whom you have met and who lives over here in Stewart now. Because my father was ill, he apparently was tubercular, Grandpa Richardson bought a piece of land with an old farmhouse on it up in Pelham, Massachusetts, and had my father, who was a very young man, go up there to live and do what work he could about the place and try to regain his health. Now, at the same time he was up there to live, my mother came up to Pelham to teach. They met and fell in love, and in spite of his bad health, they were married. Apparently he got enough better so he could do some light work, because as a little girl, very little girl, I remember vaguely riding on the mail wagon with him. He had to drive the 7 miles into Amherst, pick up the mail for the Pelham post office, and deliver it, and that would be about a day's trip to do the whole thing. In the summer, there would be an umbrella that stood up through a brace halfway across the front seat. And my recollection is of lying in the seat beside my father, sort of curled around with the handle of the umbrella against my stomach and gradually falling asleep. That's one of the few memories I have of my father. When I was about 3.5 years old, my father died, and my mother had to go back to teaching. Now, when my mother got married up in Pelham, my grandparents, who were living in Amherst at the time, were concerned about her and felt that they should be nearer to her. So they sold their place in Amherst, and they bought a house right on the top of Pelham Hill, which is about 1,200 feet elevation, very scenic. It's up on a ridge where the Route 202 now goes, and below which is the huge Quabbin Reservoir, which provides water for the city of Boston. Well, anyway, since Mother went back to teaching and went off to different places, my grandparents took me to take care of, and did that until I was old enough to go away to high school. There was no high school available in Pelham, so the first one I went to was with my mother, who was teaching in Warren, Massachusetts. I stayed there for a while, not quite till Thanksgiving, when for some reason or other it was decided that I wasn't strong enough to go to school, so I went back up and lived with Grandpa and Grandma. The next fall I started over again in Greenfield, Massachusetts, and finished the year there. Then the next year, the principal and the head of the New Salem Academy came by the house looking for pupils to go to their school, and it was agreed that I would live with Mr. and Mrs. Edwin Stowell of New Salem, because they were older people in their late 60s. Mrs. Stowell wasn't very strong, and they thought it would be nice to have me work for my board and go to the academy, where the town of Pelham would pay my tuition, since they were required to provide a high school education for anybody from Pelham who wanted it. Now we'll come to the Keep family. According to the Keep genealogy, which is found, a copy of which is found in the Northampton Public Library, the earliest record concerning our ancestor, John Keep, is in the following extract from the records of Springfield, Massachusetts, where it says in February 1660, whereas Quint Smith has liberty of abode in this town for 2 months, his time now being expired, he was by the selectmen warned this day to depart the town. And John Keep, desiring entertainment in this town as an inhabitant, his desires were granted by the selectmen the day above, and the records of Springfield have been carefully examined, and there are extracts relating to John Keep. The first thing that happened was in March, after he got there in February, he was granted 5 acres of meadow on a freshwater brook, provided all former grants of meadow be first made good. The freshwater brook is in what is now Enfield, Connecticut, south of Long Meadow. Now, he apparently was a successful person, fitted in well into the community, and records show that during the years he kept buying more property, increasing his holdings, and build up a fairly respectable amount of land. In December of 1663, he married Sarah Leonard of Springfield, and they had 5 children: Sarah, Elizabeth, who died at the age of 7, Samuel, Hannah, Jabed, who was killed by Indians in 1676. Now, I would like to read from the account of the death of these people. On Sunday, the 26th of March, some of the people of Long Meadow, men and women with children, ventured to ride to Springfield to attend public worship in company with several colony troopers. There were 16 or 18 men in all, but some had women behind them, and some had children in their arms. And when they were near Pecausic Brook, 7 or 8 Indians in the bushes fired upon the hindmost and killed a man and a maid, wounded others, and took 2 women with their babies and retired into a swamp. 6 are said to have been slain or mortally wounded. John Keep, his wife Sarah, and his infant son Jabez were 3 of them. The names of the others slain are not in the Springfield records. Those rode forward some distance toward Springfield, set down the women and maids, returned, but could not find the 2 women and children. A letter from Major Savage to the Governor's Council, dated at Hadley, March 28, 1676, gives the following account of this affair. On the 26th instant, we had advice from Springfield that 8 Indians assaulted 16 or 18 men besides women and children, as they were going to meeting from a place they call Long Meadow, and killed a man and a maid, wounded 2 men, and carried away captive 2 women and children. In the night I sent out 16 horse in pursuit of them, who met with some that were sent from Springfield, and overtook the Indians with the captives, who as soon as they saw the English killed the 2 children, and sorely wounded the women in the heads with their hatchets, and so ran away into a swamp where they could not follow them. The scouts brought back both the women and the children. One of the women remains senseless by reason of her wounds, and the other is very sensible and rational. This disaster was a severe reproach to the guards, who in a popular rhyme of the day are described, 7 Indians and 1 without a gun caused Captain Nixon and 40 men to run. Now John and his wife and little Jabez were buried in Springfield, Massachusetts, which covered larger territory than it did at the present time. Little Samuel and his 2 sisters were young and needed care. At first, Samuel was sent to live with his grandmother, and then later, his grandmother named Sarah Leonard in Springfield, and then later his uncle took care of him. The disposition of the property was that it would be taken care of by the townspeople, apparently, until he attained the age of 21. Then he would have to pay his sisters a certain lump sum of money, which would give him ownership of the property, and the sisters would have the furnishings of the house and such. Now I'll read from the genealogy of Samuel Keep, born at Long Meadow, August 22nd, 1670. After the death of his father, his grandmother, the widow Leonard, took him and his 2 sisters to her home at Springfield, but afterwards he was under the care of his uncle Samuel Bliss. He married in February 27th, 1965, to Sarah Colton of Long Meadow. She was born in September 25, 1678. As all the Keeps trace to John Keep through Samuel, we give here the ancestry of Sarah Colton, wife of Samuel Keep. Now, when I was little, I used to be told that our ancestors went to 1630. And when I read that John Keep is only listed after 1660, I wondered how they could say that with any authority, since nobody was sure just where John Keep came from when he appeared at the beginning of the history. Well, the genealogy of Sarah explains it. Sarah was the child of Thomas Colton and Sarah Griswold. Sarah Griswold was the child of Matthew Griswold and Anne Walcott. And Anne Walcott was the daughter of Henry Walcott and Elizabeth Saunders, who were married in England in Somersetshire in the year 1606. Now, the only one I'll read about is Walcott. Henry Walcott emigrated from Tolland, Somersetshire, England, at which place his family was seated as early as 1525. Henry Walcott settled in Dorchester in 1630. He was a representative to the first General Court in Massachusetts. He removed to Windsor, Connecticut, and in 1637 was elected to the lower house of Assembly. In 1643 he was elected to the House of Magistrates and annually elected until his death, which occurred in 1655. He married in January 19th, 1606, Elizabeth, daughter of Thomas Saunders of Lydiard St. Lawrence, Somersetshire, and they had the following children: John, who remained in England, Anna, Henry, George, Christopher, who inherited his homestead and died unmarried, and Mary and Simon. Now, this is not part of our line of descent, but it's interesting to know that one of Sarah brothers, Sarah's grandmother's brothers, was the father of Henry Walcott and Governor Roger Walcott. Governor Roger was the father of General Erastus in the Revolution, and Governor Oliver Walcott, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. Governor Oliver Walcott, the signer, was the father of Governor Walcott, Jr., Secretary of the Treasury, and Frederick W. Walcott, grandfather of Roger Walcott, the present governor of Massachusetts. Now we'll come to my grandfather, Jason Smith Keep, and I'll trace his lineage back. He was the number 7. His father was Ephraim. Then there was Josiah, Samuel, and John. And my mother, Eleanor, who was born February 2nd, 1855, was number 8 in the direct line of the name of Keep. And of course, with her generation, the name died out. Grandpa Keep's brother was Marcus. He was killed in the Civil War, and the Army post in Munson is named the Marcus Keep Post in his honor. Now I'll come to Grandma Keep. Her name, before she was married, was Myra Gould. She was the daughter of Mercy Gould, and I think that her father's name was George, but I'm not sure. She had several brothers and sisters, and she was the oldest. When she was 13, her father, a farmer, died of a heart attack, according to my information. And that left the mother living out in a remote farm with probably no more money in hand than what was in the sugar bowl or wherever they hid it, and 5 children, with my grandmother being the oldest. She apparently was a woman of strong stuff because she managed to bring the family up after fashion, and they survived. One story that my grandmother tells about her that's indicative of her courage, at least, was that great-grandma Gould had taken Grandma and a couple of the other children to gather blueberries. They had to go through a lot where a young stallion belonging to a neighbor was kept. Great-grandma Gould wanted the children to be very quiet because the stallion might get upset and attack them. They managed to get through the pasture one way and to the blueberry lot, and then on the way back, as they approached the fence, something caught the stallion's attention, and he felt threatened, and he came running very fast to attack them with his teeth bared. And grandmother knew that they were in terrible danger, so she grabbed for a rail off the top of the rail fence, and yelled to the children to run as fast as they could, to scramble over the fence and get away. She stood there, and as the stallion came up, rearing up as ready to strike, she managed to hit him a terribly hard blow over the nose with the rail. And of course he turned and dashed away for a minute. And he came back to the attack, and she hit him again. And by that time, the children had gotten over the fence, and she scrambled over after them, and they went on to safety. But that's just one of many stories that my grandmother told me of the fortitude of her mother, who managed, goodness knows how, to take care of them. Now, Grandma, of course, at 13, was considered pretty well grown up in those times, and she knew that she must go right to work and earn a living to help her mother support the family. The first job she had was to take care of the family of a neighbor woman who was about to have a new baby. So Grandma went there. She took care of the cleaning and the feeding and the cooking of the family, which consisted of 2 children, the man and his wife. She stayed for about a week till the woman was up and around after the birth of her 3rd child. and was very happy, looking forward to getting paid so she could help her mother. When the woman of the house thanked her, told her what a good job she'd done, how pleased she was, and as a gift gave her a rather fancy, empty candy box. Well, my poor grandmother was aghast, but she said she learned a lesson from that, and that was to never take any other kind of work until she knew exactly what all the conditions and the pay were going to be. Apparently she learned very well, because although I don't know all the steps in her growing up, quite soon after that, she got a job in a factory. She worked in a boot shop, and she worked in a corset shop, running the machine that would make some part of the things. And she tells with considerable pride what a good and fast worker that she was, and that once in the corset shop, one or two of the women went to the foreman, and they complained that Myra had a better machine than anybody else because she was earning more than anybody else in that shop. Well, the foreman wanted to keep peace, so he spoke to my grandmother about it, and she said, well, you let them choose any other machine, and I'll take that, and one of them can have my machine. Which they did, and she said within a day or two she was back again making more money than anybody else there. So you see, she was a pretty energetic little lady. She and my grandfather must have been in their 30s when they got married. And I have a picture of my grandmother at 18. Remember, at 13 she had earned this candy box. The picture I have of her at 18 shows her wearing a long gold chain, which it's solid gold. It reaches to her waist, and it held a gold watch, which she had tucked in her waistband. Now, when this picture was taken, for some reason or other, she'd forgotten to put on the watch and chain. But she was so proud of it, and to think she had earned it herself, that she had the photographer draw in the chain. And you girls who've seen the picture of Grandma remember how it looks draped down over her bosom. And she's a very strong and handsome young lady. I was always very proud that she was my grandmother. Now, I think I have covered about everything that I can tell you. I'll play this all over, and if I find anything of interest, or that I think will be of interest to add, I'll come back to this later. But as far as I know, this is the end. On playing this over, I realized that I, for some reason or other, had given Mother's birthday wrong. It's the year 1885, of course. And as long as I'm going on, I'm going to tell you a little love story that belongs in the family because I think it's quite sweet. I think I've told you girls about it at some time in the past, but I'll repeat it. My great-grandfather, Ephraim, and his father, Josiah, were to go to Springfield one day, leading a young colt that they were going to sell. I suppose they had a horse fair there occasionally. And on the way home, they got caught in a snowstorm, which was became quite threatening. So great-grandfather Ephraim said, I know a family named Smith along here somewhere, and we'll ask them if we can stay the night because we're never going to get home in all this snow. They stopped at the house and, of course, were made welcome. And in our good fortune, the snow continued for 2 or 3 days. By that time, my great-grandfather Ephraim had fallen very much in love with the daughter of the family, Julia Smith, and she with him. So as they were about to leave, he got her aside and he said, in the spring, when the roads are opened up, I'm going to come back and ask your hand in marriage. Well, that he did, and the permission was granted. So they were married and became the parents of Grandpa keep, and his brother and two sisters.